Hi all, welcome to week 3. We're going to start talking about European contact, and I'm going to review some of these other important key anthropological terms um, for the week. Before I start on that, a couple things on housekeeping. I'm adding a discussion thread so that if anybody has any particular questions, some people, I'm getting emails about some people not being able to find information in the video. Sometimes your information is going to go into more detail in the book and maybe even a little bit more research on your own part. I've created this discussion thread so that the class can kind of go through that learning experience together, and then I'll be able to answer questions maybe directed by one person, but they will reach the whole class. So please use that discussion thread each week on that topic of questions, comments, maybe even somebody wants to go down a philosophical discussion about things, maybe even semi-related to the class, but not totally. And we can do that through that discussion thread. Also, make sure that you pay attention to the announcements. When I post announcements, it's usually some update in terms of easier ways to navigate the course or whatnot. You're going to want to, and I put this in the announcements, you're going to want to use the modules. The modules are going to tell you exactly what points are for what assignments and how to navigate that. So make sure that you go through the modules as your kind of guide for the week. All right. All right, so in terms of the week, I know that I asked on the last guided lesson about egalitarianism, and I briefly touched on it, but I'm going to go in more detail now. Egalitarian tribes virtually mean equality, and then equal groups in terms of status. Okay, which looks much different than what we have today in what I would call a modern state level society, where we have a hierarchy of status, and that could be associated with your jobs, how much money you make, your status in your family. All of those things play into this concept of status. So basically, when we break down socio-political organizations, a lot of times they're also tied to their economic means or their modes of production, which then relate to modes of reproduction. So we'll discuss this as we go, and we start to discuss the various groups. Next week we start with the Arctic peoples, and ultimately the way the course is going to be guided is I'm going to ask you kind of things about how do they survive, trade, hunting, gathering. What do they do for survival traditionally, and maybe now what's changed. And we'll actually get into that at the end of the chapter with European influence in the Arctic and the fur trade. These are the levels that we break things down: band level societies, tribes, big men, big women tribes, chiefdoms, ancient state, and modern state. And I'm going to go into these in much more detail right now. Egalitarianism, we need to understand that humans lived equally for ultimately our 300,000 year existence up to about 12,000 years ago when civilization, so-called civilization, started. When I say so-called civilization, we're talking about cities, division of labor, hierarchy of status, state-level religion, those kinds of things. Egalitarian groups or band-level societies, maybe 20 to 100 people, very small, but definitely equal. And what I mean by that is that if men were the hunters and they hunted more, and women were the gatherers, there was equal status in that. The men did not have a higher place in society just because they hunted. And in many of these groups, women would go hunt too, and men would gather. So usually what we talk about this is that gender role was not strictly defined. For instance, in the 1950s, a man doing housework was seen as not being successful, right, in America. This version of the way gender roles kind of are in our society, we have put them onto other groups, and it's just not the way that things were. There are various ways of maintaining egalitarianism. And one of those ways was mocking or humor or ridicule. If somebody in a band level group, an egalitarian group, decided that they were going to have a big head for the moment or brag about themselves, the whole group would start to make fun of them. And this would basically act as a check and balance. We do this in our own little groups, especially probably in high school, even college, after that, whatever else. In our own little groups, if somebody gets too big of a head, starts to brag a little bit too much, the other group will either kind of talk behind their back and that person's supposed to figure it out, or they'll start to make fun of that individual. It's a natural human thing to do these things. We might think that they're mean in some way, but it goes back to this time period of keeping people kind of semi-equal in this way. Division of labor in terms of what people did was based on talent. And what I mean by this is that, if you were a really good hunter and you just hunted great, then that would become kind of your job and you would have that status. But then I may be a really good builder and build a house as well. So status it doesn't bring us above each other. It makes us equal because all things are valued in these societies. They're all practical, they're all functional, and they're all about survival, and it's all about cooperation in the group. So a couple things about band level societies. And egalitarianism, I should point out that egalitarianism is a mixture of some interesting things. Egalitarian band level societies operated on collective patterns of organization. They woke up and decided what was going to be done. But you should know that band level societies basically worked about 5 to 20 hours a week. That is a lot less than what we do. And when we talk about their work, we're talking about them building shelter, hunting, gathering, food. We don't call going to the grocery store or sitting in a drive-through line work. If we did, our work weeks would be more like 60 hours a week. So these people worked about 5 to 20 hours a week. And it depended on where you were and how difficult it was to gain food. Here in California, super, super easy to get food. So people did not spend a whole lot of time doing that. Gathering acorns for a day, in a native California setting, I could gather enough acorns in a day for a week. So again, if I break that down for 7 days, right? 8 hours of work, I could gather enough acorns. So in a good year in terms of a crop. Ultimately, they operated on communism, and we're going to get into the private public debate in a second. These people shared things. And what I mean by that was there was no private property. If I built a bow and arrow and Joe wanted to borrow my bow and arrow to go hunt, I would say, sweet Joe, go ahead, borrow my bow and arrow, go hunt, bring back some deer meat. This is just the way that things operated. If Joe broke my bow and arrow, he would have to replace the bow and arrow. This is common, normal sense. We think of things as don't take mine. This is mine. Private property has been built into us. And in these societies, they absolutely did not have it as part of their worldview. So they were very traditional, what we would call communistic. And when I say commune, I mean community. I do not mean Karl Marx's communism of Stalin. Stalin and the modern versions of Marxist communism has been blown into a totalitarian dictatorship version of that. Communism means that everything is public, no one owns anything, and nobody is above anybody for having those wealth discrepancies. So ultimately, we're talking about borrowing. Now, on the flip side of that, the way that people actually made decisions was democratic and self-governing. These people basically voted on things if they had to make decisions. If it didn't rain and you were located next to a river, if the band or the tribe was going to move, ultimately we would have a discussion about it. All 20 or 100 of us would get into a hut or sit around a fire, and we would have a discussion of where we were going to move. If somebody brought up, hey, down the river there's a natural spring, there's water that is still coming out of the spring there, and there's nobody occupying that territory, should we move? Ultimately, all of the adults in that group would have a vote. They would have a say, and then they would go. And those people who didn't want to go would stay. And that's how it worked. Remember, we had a lot less people on the planet prior to civilization kind of starting 12,000 years ago. There was plenty of room and land on this planet to move in that way. But remember, very much a self-governing style. This, in the modern state, has brought this back a bit. And when I say the modern state, I'm talking about certain countries. Switzerland has much more direct democracy. But California and 12 other states have direct democracy as well. We call it the initiative or proposition system. When we all show up to vote, on these propositions, we're voting for law. And that is ultimately what these people would do with self-democracy. So, self-governing, self-democracy, that's what we direct democracy. These words are pretty interchangeable. If you expanded that out, if California ultimately turned to a direct democracy, we would not have a governor, we would not have a Senate, we would not have a representative system. If there was a law that came up, then we would all vote on that law, right? And it would either become law or it wouldn't. And this is the way that these small groups worked. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it only works in small groups. This idea in terms of egalitarian, we are currently attempting, at least we have with the founding fathers of our country and many other democracies, are attempting to get back to this egalitarian model to a certain degree. The problem is that most of us are raised in a system where we learn history and it goes back to the 12,000 years where civilization started. And we don't realize that actually people came out of this self-governing public property concept. And so therefore, we're going to have some perpetuation of these concepts of hierarchy. Oh, well, we need a leader. Well, I don't know that we need a leader. Many times groups have 2 to 3 leaders, 4 leaders. In my high school group of friends of 12 people, there were 4 or 5 people that tended to make decisions, but we all did because there was no one leader that claimed control of that group. And we do this in small groups, but the question that I always get as an anthropologist is this scalable? I believe that it's scalable only if we all are taught that this can actually work. If we're taught that it's not, and we're going to be involved in war, violence, and inequalities and poverty and those kinds of things, it's not going to work because if you have those discrepancies, people with power tend to want power and people without it want it. So it has to be kind of a base level education process in my mind. And again, this is a little utopian, but for me, if I'm looking back on the last 300,000 years of human history, and most of it was done in this way, I say, well, can't we kind of go back to that, at least have more of it? And again, I think that the founding fathers try to work on this to a certain degree. So band level societies, again, 20 to maybe 300 people. I said 100 because I think that that's probably what most of these band egalitarian groups maxed out at. 300 would be a pretty big egalitarian group with no status, right? But still doable. Again, is this scalable? It is. Individuals step up to jobs based on talents. I kind of discussed this already. Decisions are made collectively. This is that self-governing. Laws govern the group, and this is by cultural norms and taboo, right? Legends. If we say that there's a pond over there, we call it the death pond because a child in our tribe died there one time, nobody's going to go there. So we name these things, we create taboos, it keeps the group safe. Also, you don't need to write laws down here. These are cultural norms. These are things that we learn through observation. We don't need to tell people every little bit. And we have cultural norms all the time that are taught, right? How to behave, how to treat elders. A lot of those things are taught by elders and older groups. If you don't teach them, then people aren't going to know these things. But I was taught at a very young age to be respectful of older individuals and shake hands and make eye contact and all of those things. But I was taught those things, and these would be cultural norms, right? We don't need to write them down. I was taught them. Again, not many surviving band level cultures left. There are some. Indonesia has some of these band level groups. The Amazon has some of them, but Westernization and modernization, Easternization has definitely changed a lot of these groups. So when I ask why not, that's pretty much your answer to that. There is so much to talk about on this level. Again, in history class, we learn, the last 12,000 years, and we take that as human history. Well, the fact of the matter is that there is a ton to talk about in this area. So most of this week, I'll be kind of focused on the breakdowns of various sides of human society, so that we can actually kind of put a shape to what we're talking about when we go through these Native American peoples. Because if we don't, we kind of view them in this mixed match way of Western thought and ethnocentricity. And I really want to break this down into a cultural relativistic kind of point of view. Band level people operated this way because it worked for them.